Welcome to Atheist Talk. I'm Matthew Richardson, your host. The program we are presenting is based on Moral Minds by Mark Hauser. My guest is Dr. Grant Steeves, who is a doctorate in theology. He will be discussing how we develop moral thinking by nature or nurture, or both, and what role religion plays in this development. Welcome, Grant.
Thank you, Matthew.
Now, I just mentioned that we develop moral thinking on nature. Can you give an example or several examples of evolutionary factors that are involved in this?
Well, this is where we start getting into the details of Mr. Hauser's book, Professor Hauser's book, in trying to describe the basis of evolutionary thought as it develops in terms of moral thinking. And perhaps a basic example would come from the research of Frans de Waal, where he is looking at primates. And if you take and you have two cages in which you have primates, and in one cage you have a primate that has access to food that could give it to the other primate. But if you all of a sudden started to cause the other primate pain, so that every time this one would eat, the other one would have pain, what he found is that the primate would stop eating so that it wouldn't cause its friend, this other primate, any pain. This led de Waal to begin to think that maybe there's an evolutionary basis for altruism and for empathy. And so that is really the beginning of some of the thinking of Hauser, and that's an example of how you start to look at evolution as a basis for morality.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain how this theory is dependent upon Immanuel Kant and how this is tied to the theory of Lawrence Kohlberg?
Yes. Hauser goes back at the very introduction, beginning of his book, goes back and looks at how we first had thought about reasoning in relationship to morality, and that we would develop it through universal principles. So Kant had developed a concept called the categorical imperative, where he, in a summary form, he would say, if it's good for me, then it must also be good in a universal sense for everyone else, in an application. And Kohlberg took that thinking and applied it in research. And much of his research was also based upon the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. And what Lawrence Kohlberg did at Harvard University was to look at the stages of moral reasoning, from the very basic one, which I've always said my dogs have moral reasoning at this level, and that is a punishment and reward system, that they will avoid doing something wrong simply because they don't want to be punished, or they might do something because they were going to get rewarded. That's level one. And then you go through the stages up to stage 6, where you finally get to that universal principle of conscience, which says, if I do something, it must be to the benefit of all people because I want other people to be able to do the same thing. So you soon would discover that killing people would end a population. This would be a negative. Therefore, we would make a law against it. But on the other hand, helping people would be a good thing. So you balance these out and you began to see how they would work rationally. Hauser, however, felt that there must be a way of looking at Kant and then later Kohlberg from an evolutionary point of view. Because how do we get there at the reasoning level? Do we have a layer beneath this? And this is where you begin to tie in to another author that Hauser depends upon, which is Chomsky. And he came to Chomsky through another philosopher, John Rawls. John Rawls, in his Justice book, equated justice and fairness. And he said, in his book, and again, he was more reason-based. He was more in the tradition of Kant and Kohlberg. Rawls said, you know, if you take and look at how we present a certain argument for behavior, people tend to do that which is fair to all people. We tend to do that. You know, you will find exceptions. You mentioned Paul Pock once to me in a conversation.
Yes.
He's an exception. But if you take the vast majority of people, there is a sense of fairness about the acts that they do, especially within their tribal group or within their smaller group. So, he then generalized to Chomsky, who looks at language or linguistics. And Chomsky had done all this research, and it has been furthered now through Steven Pinker, that says that there's an underlying pattern of how we form our languages. Whether it's Chinese or English, we still have this verb-noun kind of pattern. There are certain things that always will be present in language. So that this has been sort of established as a linguistics theory. Hauser looked at it and said, Rawls is taking this, and if I look at this, I believe, Hauser believes, that this could be applied to moral thinking. That we may have different moral guides within a group about what is appropriate or inappropriate behavior, but underneath the concept of fairness seems to be a generalized concept that goes through all cultures. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about this thread, like the linguistics thread, that runs through all cultures and through human behavior, which then would bring us to believe that it is a biological, there's a biological basis or an evolutionary basis for our behavior.
So what evidence do we have for simultaneous ideas being developed?
Well, now, and this is important in terms of what Hauser has concluded. If you just take Hauser on his own, you would say, here's an individual who's come up with a strange idea, and no one else is going to support it. I would draw a parallel to this when Darwin is developing his theory of evolution. You have a man named Wallace doing the same thing, another Englishman. And they don't really know what the other person is doing in terms of the details. But in the end, they're coming together with the same basic concept, which is evolution. So now we look at Hauser and we say, is there someone else that's doing the same kind of thing? And it just so happens Hauser works at Harvard University. But there's a young man in Australia, Richard Joyce, and he is doing work and has published a book on the evolution of morality too. So they're working simultaneously from a body of evidence, and they're coming to similar conclusions. Now, is it a perfect stream of thought? Is there, in other words, are there gaps in this that can't be proven or that cannot be identified as absolute truth? And the answer is yes. It is like the theory of evolution. Creationists would say we call it the God of the gap. Creationists would. But for evolutionists, they're saying these are areas which, given time and given the advancement of science, we will eventually be able to say this is how that particular item has evolved or has changed. Whether you're looking at the development of human beings through the various stages of evolution, physical evolution, or you're looking at it through a linguistic evolution, or if you're looking at it through a moral evolution. And so from that you could gather that simultaneously there are a number of, you might call it a critical mass of information comes about that allows people to begin to think along a particular line of idea. And you have Pinker, and you have Joyce, and you have Hauser, and you go on naming several authors that are able to support this kind of idea.
What comparisons may be drawn between humans and our close primate relatives? This question reminds me of observations and studies between a baby chimp and a baby human. And when they're young, and they're playing and interacting, and they're also given tests. And the chimp can outperform the baby human up to a point on various tests. Then the human baby outperforms the chimp. But I'm just thinking of they're looking at one another and touching one another and just playing, how close we are. This is something that Christians want to deny all the time, that we are relatives.
Right.
And it also makes me very sad that because of hunger and overpopulation in East Africa, that Africans are killing our relatives. It's almost like, eating them. It's like cannibalism to me. It makes me very sad.
Well, there's certainly so many parallels between many of the primates and the great apes and human beings. I mean, after all, our DNA is extremely close.
Yes.
In terms of the structure of it. But when you get to the area of the similarity just in terms of intelligence, it took us years to come to the understanding that they're capable of doing problem solving. So for example, the chimpanzee is in the cage and the food is out there, and they have a stick in the cage with them. And they will take the stick and they will go over and they'll pull the food toward them. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a problem solving activity. It shows that they have intelligence and that they are using that intelligence to further what they're doing. We have some evidence to the effect that they have a concept of number. All of these things, in terms of intelligence, would then bring us to the point of, well, what about their behavior, and how does this relate to altruism or to a development of concern for others? And take, for example, within the primate community, you have grooming activities, where they groom and they take off parasites from the other primate. And the question is, why do they go through this kind of behavior? Is it because they just like one another? Is it a sexual attraction? What is the behavior motivated by? And they found that the grooming is related in many cases to a kind of reciprocal activity. The old phrase, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, right, which by Kohlberg's standard is level 3 thinking, moral reasoning, that they understand that if I do this for you, you will go out and you will get food for me. And if I don't do that for you, then why should I share my food with you? But they also have something which human beings need to develop sometimes, which is called delayed gratification. They understand that at times, the one that goes out to gather food will not always succeed, and therefore, they still will continue to groom, because they know that eventually the reward will be there. Well, this is easy to see within the primate community, that they might have this kind of behavior. But there's a curious activity among bats, vampire bats. Not the vampires of movies, but these are bats that do live on blood from animals. They go out and fly around, they gather the blood, gorge on blood. They come back to the area where they are nesting. Not everyone is successful in the process of getting blood. And so they share the blood. They regurgitate and give it to other members of their family. And the question among scientists was, would they do this to one that was not a member of their group, of their tribe, in a sense? And what they found is, sure enough, at some point, they may cross over and actually give aid to a non-member of the tribe. So even in this kind of rather simple, at first, when you look at it, simple behavior, but it is behavior that is important to the preservation of the tribe or all the members within it. Could we call it empathy? Perhaps. Could we call it altruism? Perhaps. But it's certainly in a primitive state what we then would call altruism in empathy, when we do things for other people for no apparent reason at all, such as jumping into a river and saving a person's life and jeopardizing our own. This is an altruistic activity. We have no motive for going in there, certainly because it could result in our own destruction. There was a man, I think it was in the New York area, where a plane had crashed, and he went out several times, and in the process he lost his own life. But he was more concerned for the lives of others, and he made that attempt. So is it a part of our basic, in our innate, our nature, or is it something that we learn from our parents and others around us? Hauser set up a very interesting experiment, and it's found at his Harvard website. Over 300,000 people have participated in this questionnaire. And he gives 3 different scenarios. The first scenario has a train coming down a track. It's out of control. And if it continues down that track, it's going to hit 5 people. But you're on board that train, and you could make a decision to put it off on the side where it would only kill 1 person. What would you do? Well, interestingly enough, this experiment can be done in a variety of cultures and religious groups across the spectrum, just to see how people would react. No right or wrong answer, just to see what the majority of people would do. Majority of people, by the way, would go and kill the 1 over the 5. There are some that wouldn't do anything because they don't want to make a decision. They just leave it up to nature. The other experiment was you have the same tracks set up, but now you're on top of a bridge looking down on the runaway train, and you have a very large person standing next to you. If you kick this person off the platform, he could stop the train from killing the 5 people, but he would lose his life. So what are you going to do? And what they found is, in almost every case, the individual would not push him off the bridge because it's too personal. See? The third experiment, because he wants to create these layers of experimentation, the third experiment has to do with a hospital situation where there are 5 people who need emergency organ transplants. And you could take a single individual, essentially anesthetize them, and use their body organs to save 5. Would you save the 5 but kill the 1? And you get a variety of responses to this. Regardless if you're religious, very devout, or not, you find the same kinds of responses among people. So that leads you to the conclusion that people are not developing their moral beliefs because of religion, but that there is an innate basis of fairness that is involved and how they want to save lives. So it's a very interesting experiment.
Getting to that example that you just mentioned, I, of course, would not take the organs from the guy who came in to donate blood,
right.
Because if the word got out that you may be one of those who come into the hospital at the wrong time,
right.
and lose their lives to save 5, then other people would not come into the hospital to donate blood, and that would negatively affect the community.
Right. And that's one of the things that people will look at his experiment and say, well, there are contingencies in each one of the scenarios. And that's a given. His point is that there is no consistent or coherent rational decision process, whether it's religious-based or non, that there is no coherent, rational basis for the decisions that people make. But rather that it is more of an intuitive sense of fairness based upon something that is within them. In other words, an evolutionary, an evolved sense, rather than an imposed or a nurture sense. So it gets a little complex, and I think that's one of the things about Hauser's book. As fascinating as his book is, it has some complexity to it because of all of the body of information that he's pulling together to develop his theory or his idea.
So what is the neurobiological development that leads to moral aspect of early human behaviors?
Okay. This brings me back to the 1960s when I was going through a master's program at the University of Illinois. And I was majoring in rhetorical theory, communication. And at that time, it was rhetorical theory in speech. But the department was starting to be split because the communication or the science-based people were starting to take over. Well, now the same kind of thing is happening within the field of philosophy. And it started with a woman by the name of Patricia Churchland in a work on neurophilosophy. And Churchland is looking at the whole field of philosophy, which has impact on ethics and metaphysics and epistemology, all these areas of philosophy. And she is saying it is based in the brain, which means that it is innate, and that this has an impact upon how we make our decisions philosophically. Put this in another way, through the early 1960s, we tended to deal with mental illness either as demon possession or as a mental illness that you'd have to be put into a hospital and be taken care of there. And so we had mental institutions that were filled with individuals who had disorders. Along came psychopharmacology, and they were looking at the brain, and they said individuals have a chemical imbalance, much as a diabetic has a chemical imbalance, essentially. And that if you could use these chemicals, the result would be that the person would get over their depression, or at least it would be more manageable. Same with manic depression, the same with schizophrenia, a number of mental illnesses. And that has proven to be true. So once again, we are looking at the brain, and we're seeing that it's not nurture, but it is nature, that it is the innate development of the individual over a period of time. It doesn't account for all the variations in terms of conclusions that are out there, but it does give us a body of knowledge which says that there are certain stages or steps that we go through, that mental illness is not demon possession, and that it is curable or at least manageable, and that it is based on the study of the neurology, thus neurobiology or neurophilosophy. Yes. And Patricia Churchland really she based a lot of her ideas on Chomsky again, and from that they have developed this body of theory which is out there, and they're attempting to either verify or falsify the ideas that are being presented.
So what are the sociological influences upon moral development?
Okay. Sociologically, I would reference a book on How We Believe by Michael Shermer. For me, it's the easiest way to approach it. Michael Shermer looks at it in terms of tribal development. And he said that when you have a small group of people, 50 people, it's like a family, extended family. Everyone knows everyone else, and so the behavior of everyone tends to be pretty much the same. They accept what's happening. But as the number gets larger, and we get up to 100 or 150, we're moving further and further apart, and we have less and less relationship. The cousins are getting to be cousins of cousins, in a sense. Right. And then you begin to have to develop a body of control outside, a mechanism. And in some cases, especially as we get into great numbers of people, hundreds, thousands, we develop things like government and religion. That we have ways of explaining and trying to control people, manage people, and we have evolved or developed these systems into formal systems, political and religious. And they have helped to control or to manage problems that people present. And that's the sociological approach from what Shermer has looked at, that you develop family, tribe, you go up to the city or the larger group and nation building, etc.
This may be repetitive, but how does this theory that you were discussing contrast with religious theory?
Okay, the religious theory which Michael Sherman references is that at some point you began to codify, you began to put into code the behavior of people. Now, for example, there is that popular expression, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is found in the Bible and within Judaism. But it's also found among the Confucianists and among Taoists, among Hindus, among all the great religions. And the question is why? Did they have simultaneous inspiration from God? No, but they may have innate ideas which are based upon fairness, which then would account for all these differences in religion, but a common concept of fairness. So for him, religion, and I think personally, religion is this artifact that is built around and helps to codify the behavior, the proper behavior. And in the process, we have ritual and we have all kinds of other things that go with it, baggage, doctrines that are not necessary, but help to build or codify the behavior of how people should act. Sometimes government takes over that. So, for example, in the United States, we have a separation of religion and state because the state is beginning to codify what is appropriate behavior. We agree upon it. It shouldn't be religious-based. It should be based upon what is fairness. And this goes back to John Rawls and his book on justice, Theory of Justice. It is based upon a fairness doctrine. What is fair to people?
So where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here is a good question. It is obvious, the book by Hauser is, I think, is a 2007, early 2007 publication date. And we're simply beginning to develop notions or ideas of what is involved in the evolution of these things. There certainly is a huge body of information, but it's going to take time to have that all brought down so that we can see where our roots really are within science and evolution.
Wow. Well, thank you, Grant, for your participation and discussion of the issues concerning the development of morality and the book by Mark Hauser, Moral Minds. Minnesota Atheists welcomes the audience to contact us at our website or by phone as displayed on the screen. For those who do contact us, we will send you a free newsletter. And let us know the topics that you would like to explore in future programs. And if you are interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you.